On Tuesday, February 3, 2009, the last routine entry tied to Haley Curtis was stamped at 6:14 p.m. on a U.S. Forest Service Ranger Station log sheet in Elk Mountain, Wyoming. The ink was black and slightly smeared, consistent with a pen used in gloves. The building was still in the way government buildings become still after closing. Fluorescent lights humming over empty desks and a wall calendar that had not been turned since January. Outside, the wind pushed dry snow across the parking area in thin, hard ribbons. The station's exterior door latched on its own, and that small mechanical sound is the last ordinary thing anyone could later agree on. Haley Curtis was 24, known locally as dependable and quiet, with a habit of doing the same tasks in the same order. She worked long winter shifts at the ranger station, logging visitor contacts, taking weather notes, and handling radio traffic that rarely spiked above routine. Her plans, recorded only in the way coworkers described her, centered on getting home safely after work and caring for her dog. She lived modestly and moved through the day as if the weather itself were a schedule to be respected. In 2009, in places like Elk Mountain, routine was not a personality trait so much as a method of survival. The last normal day begins with a set of time marks that feel too clean because they are administrative. At 7:03 a.m., a dispatch printout from Carbon County lists a weather advisory relayed to state routes in the area with no incidents attached. At 8:11 a.m., the ranger station phone shows an incoming call from a blocked number that lasted 28 seconds. Noted only because Haley wrote "caller hung up" on a yellow sticky and placed it beside the handset. That sticky note would later be collected and sealed in an evidence bag. But on the day itself, it was just paper curling at the corner from dry heat dot at 12:37 p.m. Haley signed for a small delivery, a cardboard box of printer paper and toner cartridges, dropped at the front desk by a contracted driver. The station's receiving log contains her initials, HC, and the driver's last name, printed carefully, and a vehicle identifier written as a partial plate number. The plate entry looks finished, but the last digit is ambiguous, as if the pen skipped or the writer hesitated. That single uncertainty would sit in the file for years without comment, neither highlighted nor corrected, because it did not seem important enough to slow the day down. By late afternoon, the routine narrowed further. The temperature fell below zero, and the station's forced air heater cycled louder, making conversation difficult. Haley's coworker on day shift left at 4:30 p.m. and later wrote in a statement that Haley waved without looking up from the desk. Haley's personal vehicle, a light-colored 2003 Subaru Outback, was parked in its usual spot, angled slightly toward the exit for easier backing in snow. A worn Forest Service key ring, brass and scratched, was clipped to her belt loop, with a spare key and a small plastic tag stamped with a station inventory number. Those keys were meant to keep doors controlled and accountable. But the ring itself was an ordinary object that moved with her like a habit. The immediate crime event, as it appears in the official record, begins at 6:26 p.m. A radio check-in expected from Haley to the district office did not occur. That expectation is not a dramatic moment, just a line on a protocol sheet. End of shift contact confirmation during winter months when travel can be dangerous. At 6:34 p.m., the district office placed a call to the station. There was no answer. At 6:41 p.m., a second call went unanswered. The calls are visible as two entries on a phone bill later subpoenaed, each one short and unremarkable. The kind of administrative trying that usually ends with an apology for missing the first ring dot at 6:52 p.m. The district office requested a welfare check through Carbon County Dispatch. The dispatch log shows the request, the location code, and the assigned unit. An Elk Mountain municipal officer who was on patrol at the edge of town. The officer arrived at 7:09 p.m. and reported the station lights on, but no response at the door. There is no language of panic in the first report, only the cadence of procedure. Attempted contact. No answer. We'll check perimeter. The officer tried the main door, found it locked, and walked around the building. His boot prints later visible as shallow ovals in drifted snow along the north wall. Inside, nothing was immediately disturbed, though disturbed is a judgment that depends on familiarity. A half-full mug sat near the computer terminal, the surface of the coffee film dulling in the dry air. A stack of forms was aligned, and Haley's handwriting was visible on the top sheet, a tight, upright print. Her winter jacket was not on the back of the chair, where coworkers said she usually left it. The officer noted the absence of the jacket without interpretation, because absence was not yet evidence, only a difference from expectation. At 7:18 p.m., the officer requested a key holder. A maintenance employee arrived at 7:34 p.m. with a ring of building keys and opened the door. The air inside carried that neutral smell of paper, toner, and heated dust that settles in public offices. The desk drawer was slightly open, no more than an inch, as if it had been nudged by a knee or left that way intentionally. In the drawer was Haley's wallet, a dog-eared photograph tucked behind her driver's license, and a small receipt from the Elk Mountain Fuel and Grocery dated that morning. The receipt listed dog food and a single bottle of windshield de-icer. It was the kind of proof of ordinary life that later becomes heavy. The first officer's report ends with a line, "That does not explain itself." Vehicle not located on site. It does not specify whether the Subaru had left under its own power, whether it had been moved, or whether it had been parked elsewhere. The parking area had been windswept and partially refrozen, and there were tire tracks, but the tracks overlapped in a way that made direction hard to interpret. No one in the initial hour treated the tracks as something to preserve. No tape was put up, and no photographs were taken before additional vehicles arrived and compressed the snow. When people ask what happened to Haley Curtis, they often begin with weather, because the weather is an explanation that does not accuse anyone. The file begins instead with administrative times, a key ring, a receipt, and a log entry stamped at 6:14 p.m. In those first minutes, nothing looked like a scene, and that would matter later. The case would become a cold case in part because the first night remained on paper. A welfare check that turned into a missing person report without a clean moment where the building became evidence. If you want more documentary reconstructions like this, subscribe in a neutral way that helps the work reach the people who look for it. The ranger station was locked again at 8:02 p.m., and Haley Curtis's name was entered into a statewide missing person system with a physical description and no known direction of travel. The key ring listed on her personnel inventory was marked unaccounted for, and the receipt from the grocery was placed into an evidence envelope with no notes beyond date and time. A small detail in the receiving log, a partial plate number, stayed in the folder without a flag, because there was no reason yet to treat it as anything but handwriting. At 8:17 p.m. on February 3, 2009, Carbon County Dispatch upgraded the call type from welfare check to missing person investigation. The change is visible in the CAT event history as a short code swap, the kind of administrative edit that carries heavy consequences later. A deputy was sent from Rawlins to assist, and an Elk Mountain volunteer fire unit was asked to stand by for possible search operations. The initial perimeter remained informal, with patrol vehicles packing where it was convenient on packed snow. Headlights washing over the ranger station windows. The first coordinated action was not a search grid, but a list. At 8:34 p.m., a deputy recorded names of key holders, co-workers, and the district office staff who had attempted calls. The list was written on a legal pad, later photocopied into the case file. The original reportedly lost when the pad was reused. That loss did not register as critical at the time because no one believed the investigation would depend on the exact Sequence of who was called first. The deputy noted Haley's residence address and the presence of a dog, and requested that an officer check the home immediately. At 8:58 p.m., an officer arrived at Haley's residence, a small rental on the edge of town with a single porch light and snow piled along the steps. The door was locked. Through a front window, the officer saw a kitchen counter with a dish rack and a calendar pinned to the wall. No movement, no television glow. The officer knocked and waited, then walked around to check the back entry. The dog, a medium-sized mixed breed described later as dark-coated, was inside and began barking, then whining. The officer's report states, "Animal present. No sign of occupant." The dog's presence was treated as a time marker, an indication that Haley had not returned home to feed it. But it did not establish when she had last left the station. At 9:13 p.m., dispatch placed calls to nearby hospitals in Rawlins and Laramie. Each call is logged with the time and the name of the receiving staff member. No patient matching Haley's name or description had been admitted. At 9:24 p.m., the district office attempted to reach Haley's cell phone again. The phone went to voicemail, and the voicemail greeting was the default carrier message without a personalized name. That small fact later complicated efforts to confirm whether anyone else could have accessed the account, because it offered no voice sample for comparison and no proof of a change. At 9:41 p.m., a request went out to notify Wyoming Highway Patrol to be alert for Haley's Subaru, described as a light-colored 2003 Outback with a roof rack. The description in the bulletin included the vehicle's full plate number, taken from employment paperwork, but the earlier ambiguity in the receiving log's partial plate was not discussed. The bulletin included clothing details based on what was missing from the station, including a winter jacket not found on the chair. The absence of the jacket was a procedural anchor, but also a contradiction. If Haley left on foot in sub-zero temperatures, the jacket mattered. If she left in her vehicle, the jacket might have been on the seat. No one documented whether the station's coat hooks were checked or whether a second jacket existed. By 10:06 p.m., volunteers began to gather in the parking area of the Elk Mountain Fire Hall. The fire chief requested a map of the immediate area and identified likely routes between the ranger station and Haley's home. A crude search grid was sketched onto a printed township map using a highlighter, dividing roads and open areas into segments assigned to pairs of volunteers. Those map sheets would later be referenced in testimony as initial search documentation, but only one original sheet survived in the file. The others were said to have been discarded after getting wet, an ordinary loss that became significant only when later investigators tried to reconstruct where early searches had not gone. At 10:23 p.m., the first organized vehicle sweep began, covering the two-lane highway and the access road leading toward the station. Searchers looked for a vehicle off-road, a broken guardrail, or a set of tracks indicating a slide. The wind had increased, pushing snow back over tire marks, and visibility fluctuated with gusts. A volunteer noted a set of older tire tracks near a turnout that did not match the direction of the sweep. That note was given verbally to a deputy and never entered into the formal report. It existed later only as a memory mentioned in an interview years afterward. A memory-based image of headlights on a turnout and a hand pointing into darkness. At 11:02 p.m., a deputy returned to the ranger station to photograph the interior. The photographs were taken with a department-issued digital camera and downloaded the next day. In the evidence inventory, the camera's memory card is listed as cleared, and the photos are listed as uploaded to case folder. The case file later contained only 8 images from that night, mostly wide shots. There were no close-ups of the desk drawer, the sticky note about the blocked call, or the receiving log with the partial plate digit. The deputy wrote that the station appeared orderly. A quiet contradiction sits there because the desk drawer had been noted as slightly open. Orderly is a conclusion, and conclusions become substitutes for measurements when measurements are not. Taken. At 11:37 p.m., the deputy requested a canine unit from a neighboring county. The request is recorded, but the unit was not available until morning due to distance and weather. That delay was reasonable and procedural, but it meant the first night's efforts were limited to vehicle sweeps and door knocks. At 12:16 a.m. on February 4th, the fire hall search coordination ended, and volunteers were released with instructions to remain available. The final dispatch entry notes, "Search suspended due to conditions," a phrase that reads clean on paper and feels unfinished in practice. One witness detail entered the file early and stayed ambiguous. At 9:52 p.m., an Elk Mountain resident called dispatch to report seeing a light-colored wagon-style vehicle leaving the ranger station area quickly around 6:30 p.m. The caller could not provide a plate number. The call taker asked whether headlights were on and received an uncertain answer. The resident described seeing another vehicle, possibly a pickup, parked near the station earlier in the day. The report was typed into the CAD narrative, but no formal statement was taken that night. The absence of a statement created a gap that later investigators could not close cleanly, because memory degraded and the witness's timeline shifted each time they were asked. In the early hours, authority escalated only slightly. Local officers coordinated volunteers, county deputies handled reports, and the district office began pulling employment records. No state resources were yet assigned. At 1:08 a.m., a deputy sealed the ranger station with a strip of evidence tape across the main door, but the tape was applied after multiple entries and exits. The building became an evidence location only after it had already been used as a staging point. That sequence was documented without apology, because it was routine in small jurisdictions, and because at the time, the priority was finding a missing person rather than preserving a future prosecution. If you have information about how documentary cases like this unfold in small jurisdictions, leave a comment in a measured way that keeps the focus on procedure and documentation. By sunrise, the case had a name, a vehicle description, a handful of phone logs, and a station interior that had been photographed incompletely. The grocery receipt with dog food remained in an envelope. The sticky note about the blocked call curled more at its corner. The partial plate number in the receiving log sat uncorrected, and the map sheets from the volunteer grid search began to disappear into glove compartments and wet jackets. At 7:22 a.m. on February 4th, 2009, the first evidence inventory form was started under a Carbon County Sheriff's Office case number. The inventory lists items collected from the ranger station in a sequence that reflects convenience more than investigative theory. A yellow sticky note, the receiving log sheet for February deliveries, and the prior day's station activity log were placed into separate envelopes, each sealed and initialed. The property room later recorded those envelopes as received at 3:11 p.m. But the evidence submission time on one seal reads 2:40 p.m. The gap is not dramatic, just unexplained, a quiet custody contradiction embedded in handwriting. At 8:06 a.m., a canine unit arrived from a neighboring county. The handler's report notes sub-zero temperatures and wind. With scent conditions poor, the dog was started at the ranger station's front steps, then directed toward the parking area where patrol vehicles had idled the night before. The dog circled, then pulled briefly toward the road, then broke off and returned to the door. The handler documented the behavior as no sustained track. The absence of a track was interpreted as weather interference, but it also fit an alternative possibility that Haley left by vehicle. The decision not to restrict vehicle access to the parking lot the previous night meant the canine start point was contaminated before the dog ever arrived. By 9:14 a.m., search operations resumed with a larger footprint. volunteer firefighters, county deputies, and a small number of Forest Service staff formed teams for ground checks along ditches, culverts, and the short route between the station and town. The search plan was written on a whiteboard at the fire hall and photographed with a personal phone. That photo was never entered into evidence. The formal search documentation that remained in the file consisted of a single typed memo stating the search covered primary roadways and access points, without detailing exact coordinates. Years later, when investigators tried to identify what had been missed, they were left with the institutional shorthand of covered, a word that hides distance, visibility, and fatigue. The first key anchor object was found at 10:37 a.m. on the shoulder of a county-maintained road, a PPROXIMATEL point, 8 miles south of the ranger station. A volunteer searcher noticed a small reflective glint in the snowbank where wind had scoured down to gravel. It was a Forest Service key ring, brass and scratched, with a plastic inventory tag and 2 keys. The ring was lying flat, not embedded, with no visible blood or hair. The volunteer picked it up with a bare hand, then walked it to the nearest deputy, holding it in an open palm as if offering a lost item. The deputy placed it into a plastic bag from a first aid kit, tied it, and wrote the location on the outside in marker. The deputy's supplemental report lists the find location as near mile marker 12, but the road in question does not carry state mile markers. The volunteer later described the spot as by the cattle guard, and there are 2 cattle guards within a mile of that distance. No GPS coordinates were recorded. No photographs were taken before the ring was moved. The key ring became evidence, but its original context was not preserved, and context is often where cases live or die. The keys were later tested for prints, but the first handling and the improvised bag introduced its own contamination variables. None of that was malicious. It was small-town procedure colliding with the demands of a case that was becoming larger than its resources. At 11:26 a.m., the sheriff's office requested a state-level missing person analyst through the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation, primarily to help with information management. The request was justified by the combination of weather, risk, and the fact that a government employee had vanished from a workplace. The escalation remained limited. DCI did not assume control, but an agent advised on documentation and suggested early collection of phone records. That advice appears in a brief email printed into the file, a single paragraph that reads like a checklist. It also contains a line that was not acted on. Document all vehicle identifiers from station deliveries and service calls. The receiving log with the ambiguous plate digit was already in an envelope, but no one returned to clarify the driver's identity. That week, an early scene mishandling became visible in the treatment of the ranger station itself. At 12:03 p.m., Forest Service maintenance staff were permitted to enter the building to secure equipment and shut down non-essential systems. The decision was made in coordination with the district office and noted in a memo as necessary for safety and energy conservation. The memo does not list what was moved. A later walkthrough by a deputy noted that the desk had been cleared and the mug seen the night before was gone. The case file contains no property sheet for the mug, no photographs of where it had been, and no explanation of who removed it. A single missing object can be trivial, but it can also be a marker of how porous the scene became in the first 48 hours. At 1:17 p.m., Haley's Subaru Outback was located, but not where anyone expected. A Wyoming Highway Patrol trooper found it parked in a plowed turnout off a state route approximately 13 miles west of Elk Mountain, near a rest area sign. The vehicle was locked. There was a thin layer of wind-driven snow across the hood and roof, suggesting it had been there overnight. The trooper ran the plate, confirmed registration, and called for a tow rather than attempting entry on scene. The tow operator later described attaching the winch hook while the trooper stood back, hands in pockets, watching the wind move across the asphalt. The vehicle became the second anchor object, and the way it was processed carried early errors. At 2:44 p.m., the Subaru was towed to a county impound lot. The lot was outdoors, fenced, and surfaced with gravel. There is no record of a tarp or indoor storage. Photographs were taken after the tow, showing the vehicle in profile with snow on the tires. The first officer to look inside did so through the glass, noting a winter jacket on the passenger seat and a leash coiled on the floorboard. The presence of the jacket contradicted the earlier assumption that Haley left without it. The contradiction was entered into a report without any reconciliation, as if both versions could sit side by side indefinitely. At 3:38 p.m., the deputy requested a warrant for vehicle entry, but the warrant application was delayed until the following morning due to the availability of a judge. In the meantime, the vehicle remained in the lot. An impound log shows that the gate was opened multiple times that evening for unrelated tows, and the Subaru's proximity to the entrance is visible in one photo. There is no indication anyone tampered with it, but the environment was uncontrolled compared to an indoor evidence bay. In the evidence world, uncontrolled does not mean compromised, but it means questions multiply later. A subtle helpful figure appears in the file during this period. A local mechanic named Brent Saylor, who had a contract with the Forest Service for occasional maintenance, contacted deputies to say he had seen Haley's Subaru in town the prior week and could tell you if it's running right. He offered to inspect it once it was opened, framing it as assistance. His name was written into a contact log as resource, and he was not treated as a suspect. The contact log notes he knows vehicles and knows station routines. In a small town, helpfulness is often accepted at face value, and the file reflects that cultural default. By late afternoon, the case had 2 physical anchors and a growing set of procedural gaps. The keys were found without coordinates. The station interior changed without documentation. The Subaru sat behind a fence in the wind, holding whatever it held behind locked doors and fogged glass. The receiving log, with its ambiguous plate digit, remains sealed as an administrative artifact rather than an investigative lead. In a later cold case review, these are the kinds of early choices that read like turning points. But in real time, they were ordinary decisions made under weather pressure and limited staffing. If you want to support documentary work that stays close to records and procedure, like the video in a neutral way that signals interest without turning the subject into entertainment. The tow receipt for the Subaru was stapled into the file with the time of pickup and the impound address. The evidence tag on the key ring was written with the wrong road name and never corrected, only cross-referenced. The first lab submission form was prepared but not sent because the county had to decide what to prioritize. In the corner of the case folder, someone wrote HC in pencil and underlined it once as if to make the initials hold. On February 5, 2009, at 9:12 a.m., the search phase transitioned into an interview phase. Not by formal announcement, but by the way, deputies stopped asking volunteers to meet at the fire hall. The snow remained, the wind remained, and the practical limits of visibility had already been reached. A detective from the Carbon County Sheriff's Office began scheduling statements in a small interview room with a metal table, a wall clock that ran a minute fast, and a recorder kept in a locked drawer. The recorder was used inconsistently. Some interviews are summarized in narrative form. Others have full transcripts. Several are referenced but missing. Haley's district supervisor provided the first structured account. The supervisor described Haley as reliable, quiet, and resistant to improvisation. Someone who checked doors twice and wrote down small deviations in a notebook. The supervisor stated that Haley had no known disputes at work and had not requested time off. The supervisor also described a routine of end-of-shift check-ins during winter months and emphasized that missing the 6:26 p.m. radio contact was not like her. The report includes that line, but it also notes the supervisor could not confirm whether Haley had ever missed a check-in before. The file holds both statements without resolving them, a contradiction born from memory and the need to communicate urgency. A coworker interview introduced a detail that seemed small enough to ignore. The coworker said Haley had mentioned a strange call earlier that week, someone asking about road closures in an oddly specific way. The coworker could not recall the date. The ranger station phone records did show a blocked call on February 3rd at 8:11 a.m., but blocked calls were not unusual. The detective wrote possible prank in the margin. The sticky note about caller hung up stayed in its envelope, treated as a minor artifact rather than a lead. The contradiction here is procedural. The file contained a physical note acknowledging the call, yet the investigative narrative downgraded it without documenting why. Interviews with neighbors in Elk Mountain were conducted at kitchen tables and front doors, recorded in reports that read like weather logs. One neighbor said Haley walked her dog at the same time each evening and avoided the highway shoulder after dark. Another said Haley's porch light was often left off to save power, but it had been on the night she went missing. The porch light detail carried emotional weight for people who knew her, but the report treated it as neutral. The detective's notes include porch light on equals unusual, then could be officer. The quiet contradiction is that the officer who checked the home did not record turning the light on, and no one could later say whether it was on before law enforcement arrived. On February 6th, the Subaru was finally opened under a warrant signed by a county judge at 8:43 a.m. The vehicle was processed in the impound lot rather than moved to an indoor bay. Photographs show gloved hands working in wind, paper evidence bags weighted with clipboards so they would not blow away. The inventory lists: one winter jacket on the passenger seat, one set of gloves in the center console, a leash on the floorboard, a hairbrush with light hair strands, and a folded state highway map in the door pocket. The map became another anchor object, not because of what it showed immediately, but because it looked handled. The fold creases were softened, and one corner was torn, suggesting repeated use. There were no obvious signs of a struggle inside the Subaru. No blood was visible, and no damage to the steering column or doors was noted. The ignition key was not present. The report includes a line that vehicle appears staged, but the same report admits there was no baseline for how Haley kept her car. The staging conclusion was interpretive, not measured. The detective also noted a single boot print visible on the driver's side floor mat, but the print was not photographed with a scale before the mat was removed. The mat was later stored folded in a paper bag. Folding can distort impressions, a procedural issue that becomes a problem only when comparison is needed. Brent Saylor, the local mechanic who had offered help, was interviewed on February 7th. His statement was recorded in a report tone that conveys cooperation. He said he knew Haley, in passing, through Forest Service work orders and had seen her vehicle around town. He reported being at his shop until 6 p.m. on February 3rd, then at home. No corroborating documentation was collected beyond a note that his wife confirmed. The detective wrote no issues and moved on. The file's handling of Saylor is restrained but also incomplete. In later cold case reviews, this early acceptance of a casual alibi would stand out. But in 2009, it matched the investigative economy of a small agency, balancing multiple calls. Another interview with the delivery driver who brought toner and paper on February 3rd should have been straightforward, but it was not. The receiving log listed the driver's last name and a partial plate digit that could not be read cleanly. Deputies contacted the contracting company and obtained the roster. A driver with a matching last name said he did deliver to the station, but could not recall Haley specifically. He provided a vehicle number rather than a plate. The detective noted that the company swapped trucks frequently. The report ends with unable to confirm plate. The overlooked detail was already present: the ambiguous digit on the receiving log, and the fact that someone had tried to record it. Yet no follow-up was documented to compare fleet vehicle numbers to plates in the company's DMV records. The file contains the question, but not the work to answer it. Institutional limits began to show in the way evidence was described. The sheriff's office submitted the keyring and the Subaru floor mat for fingerprint processing to the state crime lab, but requested latent prints only, citing budget. Hair strands from the brush were not submitted. The sticky note was not submitted. The map was not submitted. Each omission had a reason that would sound reasonable in a memo: low probability, limited funds, uncertain relevance. The case file includes a budget request denial for overtime, stamped and filed. The stamp is crisp and bureaucratic, a memory image of paperwork deciding what can be searched and tested. By late February, the investigative timeline had hardened around certain assumptions. Haley was last confirmed at work at 6:14 p.m. Her vehicle was later found west of town. Her keys were found south of the station. Those locations did not align neatly. One theory in the file suggested she left the station, drove west, then returned south, dropping keys, but the sequence lacked support. Another suggested the keys were planted. The reports avoid committing, but the contradictions sit in the geography. When investigators cannot reconcile geography, they often turn back to people. And the interviews continued without producing a single lead strong enough to justify deeper escalation. The ranger station itself, which had been taped, was reopened for normal operations by March 2nd. A memo from the Forest Service notes operations resumed. Investigative access available upon request. The memo reads cooperative, but it also means the building's status as a scene dissolved into daily use. The empty desk where Haley had worked became occupied again. The file contains a photograph taken months later of the same room with different paperwork and a different mug. The image is calm and functional, and it makes the earlier lack of documentation feel permanent. On April 14, 2009, Carbon County filed a case. Status memo that used the phrase active pending. Leads. It was a common administrative label that signaled nothing was formally closed while also acknowledging there was nothing new to pursue. The memo was placed behind an evidence inventory and a stack of search summaries, and it did not change operations on the ground. The searches had already narrowed to occasional checks when weather improved and volunteers had time. Haley Curtis's missing person entry remained in state and national systems, updated only when investigators could justify new information. The last major search effort of that spring occurred on May 9th, organized quietly through the fire hall without the earlier urgency. Teams re-walked segments of the highway and the access road near the ranger station, looking for overlooked items revealed by melting snow. A deputy documented the search as negative, but one volunteer later recalled finding a torn piece of paper near a drainage culvert. The paper was not collected because it was wet and unreadable. The memory persists in the file as a second-hand note, possible paper debris, not retained. It is the kind of small loss that becomes meaningful only when the case has nothing else. In June, the State Crime Lab returned results on the items that had been submitted. The key ring produced no usable latent prints. The floor mat produced partial impressions that were insufficient for comparison. The lab report is technical and restrained, and it reads like a door closing without drama. The report also notes that items were received in packaging not ideal for latent preservation, an institutional way of saying early handling mattered. There is no reprimand, Just a sentence that sits in the file like a quiet corrective. Phone records arrived later than investigators expected. A subpoena issued in March produced billing logs in July, due to carrier processing time and the need for a judge's signature renewal. The records showed Haley's phone had last connected to a tower near Elk Mountain at 6:19 p.m. on February 3rd, then registered no further activity. The log contained no outgoing calls after that time. Investigators treated the tower ping as consistent with her being near the station, but it also did not exclude travel because rural tower coverage can be broad and variable. The records created a procedural anchor without creating direction. The phone itself was never recovered. By August, the case file shows a shift in tone. The notes become shorter. Interviews are fewer. A detective wrote awaiting new info on multiple pages. The Forest Service District Office requested periodic updates, and the Sheriff's Office responded with brief summaries that repeated known facts. The repetition itself is a form of stagnation. Each retelling hardened the same time marks and the same objects into the story. The 6:14 p.m. log entry, the keys in the snowbank, the Subaru at the turnout, the grocery receipt with dog food. None of these items changed. Their meaning did not deepen, because there was no new context. A bureaucratic decision that would later matter occurred. On October 2, 2009, the Sheriff's Office conducted an evidence room audit after a staffing change. During the audit, several items from the Haley Curtis case were repackaged into standard envelopes and boxes for long-term storage. The repackaging is documented in a property room worksheet. The worksheet lists the key ring, the sticky note, the receiving log sheet, the grocery receipt, and the Subaru floor mat. It does not list the folded highway map, which had been photographed and then returned to the vehicle during processing. That choice was made casually, based on the belief that the map was personal property without evidentiary value. The map's absence from the evidence inventory became a gap that no one noticed. Because the case was losing momentum. In December, the Sheriff's Office issued a formal inactive designation. The designation did not mean the case was closed, but it allowed resources to be directed elsewhere. The decision is captured in a one-page memo signed by the sheriff and initialed by a county attorney. The memo cites no viable leads and investigative steps exhausted within current capacity. The phrasing is careful. It acknowledges limits without naming them directly. The county did not have a dedicated major crimes unit, and it relied on state lab submissions that required prioritization. The escalation ladder stopped at advisory support. There was no task force, no federal involvement, no sustained forensic campaign. Haley's family received the inactive memo in a meeting described in a deputy's report as difficult but respectful. The report does not describe emotion beyond that. It lists who attended, the time the meeting began, and the fact that family members were provided a copy of the missing person flyer for distribution. The flyer itself, preserved in the file, shows Haley's photo with a neutral smile and a plain background. The corners of the flyer in the folder are creased, suggesting it was handled and refiled more than once. It is a memory-based object that outlives the early searches. In January 2010, a final procedural action was taken that would matter later. The Subaru, after being held for nearly a year, was released from evidence status and returned to Haley's family through a court order. The order is concise, noting that the vehicle had no further evidentiary value under current investigative posture. Before release, the vehicle was detailed by a local service. The service invoice, included in the family's later civil file, lists vacuuming, shampooing the seats, and wiping interior surfaces. That cleaning eliminated any chance of later recovering trace evidence from the vehicle's interior. At the time, it was framed as restoring personal property. In hindsight, it was the irreversible end of a forensic opportunity. But the file does not treat it that way because the choice was made under the assumption that nothing more could be extracted. The case then became a box. The evidence room log shows H. Curtis Haley placed on a shelf labeled missing inactive with a barcode sticker applied to the outside of a banker's box. Inside were paper envelopes, lab reports, photocopied maps, and a few photographs. The key ring sat in a small bag within a larger envelope, metal against plastic. The grocery receipt was filed flat to avoid further fading. The sticky note was taped to a backing sheet so it would not curl. The receiving log sheet with the ambiguous plate digit remained exactly as it had been collected, an administrative artifact that had never been treated as a problem to solve. Quiet contradiction persisted even as the file went dormant. The keys were found south of the station. The Subaru was found west of town. The phone last pinged near Elk Mountain. These points did not form a coherent route, and no one could document how they were supposed to. The absence of a coherent route is not a dramatic cliffhanger. It is an evidentiary pressure point, the kind that makes a case feel unfinished even when paperwork says inactive. The box was sealed, cataloged, and shelved, and the shelf itself became part of the record. On September 18, 2021, the Haley Curtis case moved from an evidence shelf to a conference table because a new sheriff asked for a cold case review as part of an accreditation push. The request was not triggered by a confession or a tip. It was triggered by an audit requirement that inactive cases involving potential foul play be evaluated at set intervals. The case file was retrieved from storage at 9:03 a.m., scanned for missing documents, and assigned to a two-person review team. The team included a county detective with less than 5 years on the job and a Wyoming Division of Criminal investigation agent detailed part-time to cold cases. The first step was an inventory that treated the file as a physical object with its own history. The evidence room produced a log showing each time the banker's box had been opened. There were only 3 entries after 2010: an audit, a records request for a media inquiry, and a brief review in 2015 that ended with no action. The 2021 team photographed the box contents as laid out on butcher paper. The photographs show old envelopes with yellow tape, fading ink on seals, and a stack of reports clipped together with rusting metal. The stillness of the objects mattered because cold case work begins with accepting that the past will not be recreated. Only re-measured. The reopened review created an escalation in capability by design. Carbon County could request expanded lab work through state channels that were not available or not affordable. In 2009, the DCI agent's presence allowed direct access to state systems and coordination with federal resources if thresholds were met. On September 22nd, the team submitted a formal request to the Wyoming State Crime Lab for modern touch DNA testing on the key ring and for document analysis on the receiving log and sticky note. The submission packet includes a new chain of custody form that references the original seals and notes, prior packaging not ideal. That sentence is restrained but carries a corrective purpose. The team also rebuilt the timeline using primary records rather than narrative summaries. They pulled the original dispatch CAD history, the ranger station's radio logs, and archived phone billing records that had been printed and filed. They entered each time mark into a spreadsheet and linked it to a source document number. The last confirmed station log entry at 6:14 p.m. remained. The missing radio check at 6:26 p.m. remained. The cell tower connection at 6:19 p.m. remained. Those times were close enough to be plausible together, but close enough to create tension if one were wrong. The team flagged the tension without resolving it, because they could not assume which record carried error. A procedural anchor emerged from an old document that had not been treated as evidence in 2009, the tow receipt for the Subaru. The receipt included a pickup time, a location description, and the tow operator's identifier number. The location description referenced a rest area sign and a state route. In 2009, it was filed as logistics. In 2021, it became a location control point. The team requested Wyoming Department of Transportation maintenance records for that segment of road to determine whether any cameras, plow logs, or sign maintenance reports existed that could place a vehicle there earlier or later than the troopers' discovery. The request was narrow and procedural, designed to avoid speculation. On September 29th, the team contacted the Forest Service to obtain archived ranger station access records. In 2009, the station used physical keys and a basic alarm system that logged arm and disarm events. The alarm logs were not requested at the time, likely because no one believed they would add more than what the logbook already showed. In 2021, the district office produced a printed alarm history for February 3rd and 4th, 2009, retrieved from an archived vendor portal. The printout showed an arm event at 6:22 p.m. and no disarm event afterward until a maintenance keyholder entry the following night. This created a quiet contradiction with the assumption that Haley remained in the building until 6:26 p.m. for a scheduled radio check-in. If the building was armed at 6:22 p.m., either someone armed it before leaving, or the timestamps were offset, or the printout was incomplete. The team did not treat it as a revelation. They treated it as a measurement problem. The review also focused on custody condition. The key ring was still sealed, but the outer bag had been tied rather than heat-sealed, and the marker ink on the outside had bled. The sticky note had been taped to a backing sheet, but the tape adhesive had yellowed and overlapped part of the handwriting. The receiving log sheet was intact, but a photocopy had been stapled to it at some point, leaving rust marks near the margin. These are small physical degradations that can affect later lab work. The team documented them with scale photos, treating deterioration as part of the record rather than as embarrassment. Scientific re-entry began with what could be tested, now that could not be tested then. On October 6th, the crime lab acknowledged receipt and assigned a case number. The lab's intake note lists touch DN on metal key ring surfaces, document examination, handwriting, and indentation. Latent prints were processed due to improved techniques. The lab also requested elimination samples. Haley's family provided a reference sample through a swab kit handled by a local clinic and documented with a lab submission form. The goal was not to find DNA in the abstract, but to separate Haley's expected DNA from unknown contributors. Cold case forensics is often subtraction before it is discovery. At the same time, the DCI agent reviewed old interviews for unpursued leads that met modern thresholds. Brent Saylor's 2009 statement was reread. His alibi had been accepted with minimal corroboration. That fact alone did not justify action, but it justified a renewed look at his known movements and any records that could support or contradict them. The agent requested, through an administrative subpoena, archived phone subscriber information for numbers that had contacted the ranger station in the week prior to Haley's disappearance. The blocked call on February 3rd at 8:11 a.m. could not be identified through ordinary billing logs, but the carrier could sometimes reveal a masked call under a court order if a specific time, window, and receiving number were provided. The team began preparing that application, knowing it would require a judge and a stronger justification than curiosity. A new memory-based image entered the case in 2021, not from a witness but from the file itself. In the evidence room, photo set, the banker's box sits open on a stainless steel table. Behind it are rows of shelves and fluorescent lights. The label on the box is handwritten in block letters: Curtis, Haley missing. The handwriting is not the same as any current staff members. It belongs to a prior era of the agency. and it makes the gap in years visible without saying it out loud. By October 18th, the team had a rebuilt timeline, an alarm log contradiction, and a set of lab submissions in progress. They also had an unanswered detail that had survived untouched: the ambiguous last digit of the delivery vehicle plate recorded on the receiving log. In 2009, it had been treated as clerical noise. In 2021, it was treated as a decision point. The team requested the original log sheet be examined for indentation, marks that could clarify the digit, and for any pressure impressions from writing beneath it. It was a small request that fit within document examination, and it did not require a new theory, only a new willingness to measure what had been left unmeasured. On November 9, 2021, the Wyoming State Crime Lab returned an interim report that changed the case without declaring it solved. The report did not contain a match, an arrest name, or a dramatic conclusion. It contained a clarification. Document examination of the ranger station receiving log showed a faint indentation, consistent with a single vertical stroke at the end of the partial plate entry. Under oblique light, the examiner concluded the ambiguous digit was most consistent with a 1, not a 7 or an incomplete 4. The conclusion was written cautiously, but it transformed an unresolvable scribble into a specific identifier that could be tested against records. The overlooked detail that had sat in an envelope since 2009 became actionable because it could finally be treated as data. The same report included a second finding that forced a timeline correction. The alarm history printout provided by the vendor was validated, and the lab noted the vendor's internal clock settings were synchronized to network time. The alarm event at 6:22 p.m. on February 3, 2009, was therefore unlikely to be a simple offset. That meant the station was armed before the scheduled 6:26 p.m. check-in, or the check-in protocol was misremembered, or Haley did not intend to remain on site after 6:22. The rebuilt spreadsheet was updated to place the last confirmed station occupied moment earlier than investigators had assumed. The difference of 4 minutes sounds minor, but in cold cases, small differences are where the false certainty lives. On November 12th, the DCI agent and county detective used the clarified plate digit to reopen the delivery thread. The contracting company from 2009 had been acquired and rebranded, but legacy fleet records were retained for insurance and tax purposes. A records custodian produced a 2009 vehicle assignment sheet for the driver named on the receiving log. The sheet listed a truck with a plate ending in 1, matching the clarified digit, and included an internal asset number. The company also provided a route manifest showing the driver's delivery sequence that day. The manifest placed the ranger station stop at 12:37 p.m., consistent with Haley's initials on the log. It also showed an additional unscheduled stop in Elk Mountain at 5:58 p.m., flagged as return to site paperwork, with no receiving signature. That second stop created an immediate contradiction with the original investigation narrative. In 2009, no report mentioned a delivery truck returning near closing. The company's manifest suggested a company vehicle was in town within a half hour of Haley's last documented station entry. The investigators did not treat the manifest as proof of contact. It was a procedural record that indicated presence. Presence is not guilt, but presence is enough to justify deeper inquiry. The next escalation was jurisdictional and technical, because the delivery company operated across state lines and the records involved interstate commerce. The DCI agent contacted an FBI field office liaison for assistance with rapid records acquisition and to ensure any subpoena process would be admissible if the case moved toward prosecution. The FBI did not take control, but the involvement allowed the team to obtain archived cellular network data with a narrower legal pathway. On November 18th, A judge signed an order compelling the carrier to disclose the source number of the blocked call received by the ranger station at 8:11 a.m. on February 3, 2009, and to provide any available cell site information associated with that call. The carrier response arrived on December 6th. The blocked call originated from a prepaid phone number activated in Rawlins in late January 2009. The account was minimal, with cash purchase records unavailable due to the time elapsed. What remained was network data. The number connected to a tower near Elk Mountain at 8:10 a.m. on February 3rd, consistent with the call. More significantly, the number registered again near Elk Mountain at 6:20 p.m. on the same day, within minutes of the station alarm event and Haley's last known phone connection. The number then showed a brief registration near the state route where Haley's Subaru was later found, around 7:03 p.m., before going dark permanently. These were not continuous pings, only registrations. But the pattern aligned too closely with the case's anchor locations to be ignored. Anchor objects returned with new meaning in a way that was procedural rather than symbolic. The key ring found south of the station had always suggested movement away from the building. The Subaru at the west turnout had always suggested displacement. Now, with the prepaid number's tower registrations, those objects became points in a corrected route. The route did not prove what happened to Haley, but it suggested a coherent travel line that the original file lacked. The grocery receipt, once just evidence of ordinary life, also acquired new relevance because it fixed Haley's morning routine and supported the timeline of her being in town earlier, reducing the likelihood that the day itself had been chaotic before evening. On December 14th, the crime lab issued its final touch DNA, a report on the key ring. The lab recovered a mixed DNA profile from the metal surfaces. Haley's DNA could not be excluded as a contributor, which was expected. A second contributor profile was also present. The profile was partial, but sufficient for entry into CODIS as an unknown. CODIS returned no match. That absence did not end the value of the profile. It set up the next step, targeted comparison if investigators could identify a likely contributor through records and interviews. The lab report includes a note that the key ring had been handled by multiple unknown persons before collection, which complicated interpretation. That warning did not erase the result, but it forced investigators to treat the DNA as a lead, not as a conclusion. Suspicion became action when the team reconciled the new route with people who could plausibly occupy it. The delivery driver identified in the receiving log was re-interviewed on December 20. He acknowledged returning to Elk Mountain that evening to retrieve paperwork he believed he had left at the station. He said he did not see Haley and claimed he did not enter the building. He provided a timeline that placed him back on the highway by 6:10 p.m. The investigators compared that claim to the manifest's return to site entry at 5:58 p.m. and to the prepaid phone's registration near Elk Mountain at 6:20 p.m. The driver denied owning a prepaid phone. He also stated he was alone. The contradiction was not yet proof of deception, but it was enough to justify examining his associations. The name Brent Saylor reappeared, not as a sudden twist, but as a convergence of records. In 2009, Saylor was logged as a helpful mechanic with Forest Service contacts. In 2021, the investigators learned, through DMV and employment checks, that Saylor had done contract work for the same delivery company in early 2009, servicing fleet vehicles at a discounted rate. The connection was documented in an invoice archive the company retained. The invoice listed Saylor's shop name and included a handwritten note about paperwork pickup. The note could have been routine. It could also have been a reason for a return trip that looked legitimate. The investigators now had a triangle: the receiving log with a clarified plate digit, the prepaid phone pattern, and the local contractor with access and relationships that had never been treated as relevant. By January 5, 2022, the county detective drafted affidavits for search warrants, not for the delivery driver's home, but for digital and business records connected to Saylor's shop. The warrants were narrow, focused on archived phone records, invoices, and any retained GPS units from fleet service vehicles. The affidavits cited the corrected timeline, the alarm log, the carrier's disclosure of the blocked call source, and the route manifest. The investigative posture shifted from waiting to measuring. The case was no longer a missing person file on a shelf. It was a set of documents that now supported compelled access to more documents, which is how cold cases become active cases again. On January 11, 2022, a district court judge signed 2 search warrants and 3 production orders tied to the Haley Curtis investigation. The warrants authorized seizure of business records, electronic devices, and storage media from Brent Saylor's repair shop and adjacent office space in Elk Mountain. The production orders went to a cellular carrier for historical subscriber metadata, to the delivery company for archived route and maintenance records, and to the Forest Service for access logs and contractor communications. The documents were written narrowly, with date windows centered on late January through February 2009, and with an explicit chain of custody plan for any digital evidence. The warrant service was procedural and quiet. DCI and Carbon County executed it at 7:18 a.m. before the shop opened. The building was cold, with fluorescent lights clicking on above workbenches and a calendar pinned to a plywood wall. Saylor was present, having arrived early, and was given a copy of the warrant and a property receipt. The inventory log shows items collected in numbered evidence bags, a desktop computer tower, 2 external hard drives, a box of paper invoices labeled 2008 to 2010, an old flip phone found in a desk drawer, and a small GPS unit used for fleet test drives. Each item was photographed in place before being moved, a correction of the early case habit of picking up first and documenting later. Saylor was interviewed the same day at 10:42 a.m. in the sheriff's office. The interview was recorded and transcribed. He reiterated his 2009 statement that he had been at his shop until 6 p.m. on February 3rd, then at home. When asked about contract work for the delivery company, he acknowledged it and described it as routine maintenance. He denied any involvement with Haley's disappearance and denied contacting the ranger station that day. When confronted with the existence of a prepaid phone number linked by tower data to the ranger station at 8:11 a.m. and again near 6:20 p.m., he said he did not own a prepaid phone and had no reason to use one. The contradiction was noted, but investigators did not argue. They moved to verifiable points. Phone records, invoices, and digital logs. Digital forensics began with preservation. On January 12th, the seized drives were imaged by a DCI forensic examiner in Cheyenne. Hash values were recorded, and the originals were sealed. The examiner's report notes the equipment was dated but functional. The desktop's operating system showed last use dates consistent with the shop environment, and the external drives contained scanned invoices and photos of vehicle damage claims. In a folder labeled Fleet, the examiner located a spreadsheet of service appointments for multiple companies, including the delivery contractor. The spreadsheet contained entries for paperwork run and station, with dates that matched the delivery manifest's unscheduled stop. The entries were not proof of a crime, but they corroborated that the return trip was planned and known in Saylor's orbit. The flip phone collected from the desk drawer became a focal object, because it was the kind of device associated with prepaid accounts in 2009. The phone's SIM card was present. The examiner extracted the phone's stored number and partial call history. The call history did not reach back to 2009, but the SIM identifier could be linked through carrier records. On January 19th, a carrier compliance response tied the SIM identifier to the prepaid number that had placed a blocked call to the ranger station at 8:11 a.m. on February 3, 2009. The account registration remained anonymous, but the physical SIM was now in evidence, and it had been recovered from Sailor's office. That connection moved the case from pattern to attribution. Investigators then treated the anchor objects as reference points for a search plan. The GPS unit seized from the shop was an older standalone device with removable storage. The device still contained saved locations. Among them was a waypoint labeled Turnout, with coordinates matching the state route turnout where Haley's Subaru had been found. Another saved point corresponded to a county road segment near where Haley's keyring had been recovered. The device did not record dates for waypoints, and it could not prove the device was used on February 3, 2009. It did, however, show familiarity with the same locations that had previously seemed disconnected. The investigators documented the waypoints with screenshots and created a map overlay. The overlay did not accuse anyone. It illustrated that the locations existed in Sailor's stored navigation data. On January 24th, a second warrant was obtained for Sailor's DNA sample, justified by the mixed profile recovered from the keyring and the newly attributed prepaid SIM. The sample was collected by buccal swab under supervision and logged into evidence with a lab submission form. The crime lab comparison process took place under standard protocols, with elimination samples documented. On February 8th, the lab reported that Sailor could not be excluded as the second contributor to the DNA mixture on Haley's keyring, with statistical support sufficient for investigative use. The lab's language remained careful. It did not state the DNA proved he handled the keys on the day of the disappearance. It stated the profile was consistent. With those results, investigators escalated to a physical search tied to warrants and probable cause rather than hope. On February 16, 2022, a search warrant was executed on a rural property outside Elk Mountain that Sailor had leased in 2009 for equipment storage, identified through old tax records and a utility account found in the shop's files. The property included a small metal outbuilding and a fenced area. The search team included DCI, Carbon County, and a forensic archaeologist requested through a state resource network. An escalation justified by the age of the case and the possibility of buried evidence. The archaeologist's role was not theatrical. It was measured, ground survey, soil disturbance assessment, and controlled excavation if warranted. The search produced a multi-stage reveal that stayed within documentation. In the outbuilding, investigators found an old plastic storage bin with faded masking tape on the lid. Inside were miscellaneous papers, including a stack of Forest Service contractor invoices and a folded state highway map similar in style to the one photographed in Haley's Subaru. The map had handwritten marks in pencil near Elk Mountain and along the state route west. The markings were not labeled as Haley's. They were simply present. The bin also contained a key tag stamped with a Forest Service inventory number that matched the format of the tag on Haley's missing keyring, though not the same number. The find was logged, photographed, and sealed, and its meaning left for later analysis. On the property's edge, near a windbreak of trees, ground-penetrating radar indicated a small disturbed area inconsistent with natural soil layering. The team marked the area and began a controlled excavation. They did not expand beyond the flagged zone. At 3:26 p.m., a forensic technician recovered a fragment of fabric consistent with outerwear material and a corroded metal zipper pull. The items were placed into separate bags with soil samples. The recovery was incomplete, and no identification was made on scene. The evidence was transported under seal to the state lab for examination. The day ended without a declaration. The warrant return lists what was seized and where, and the investigators' notes include the same restrained language found throughout the file. Items recovered pending analysis. What had changed was the procedural posture. The case now had attributed communications, a corroborated relationship between sailor and the delivery return trip, ADN, a consistency result tied to an anchor object, and a controlled recovery site producing physical materials. Those elements did not answer everything. They narrowed what could be true, which is the function of warrants and lab work when a story has been living too long on paper. On February 28, 2022, the Wyoming State Crime Lab issued a material analysis report on the items recovered from the rural property excavation. The fabric fragment was consistent with a synthetic outerwear shell, and the zipper pull was consistent with a mid-2000s mass-produced winter jacket component. Those findings were not unique enough to identify Haley. The report did, however, document the presence of human decomposition-associated chemical indicators in the soil sample taken adjacent to the fabric, identified through standard laboratory screening. The lab stopped short of stating what had occurred at the site. It stated only that the soil chemistry was consistent with a body having been present. That distinction mattered for admissibility. Consistent is not proof. It is a measurable condition that can support probable cause when combined with other evidence. With that report in hand, Carbon County and DCI requested additional resources to complete a broader recovery. The county attorney filed a motion to expand search authority on the leased property and to obtain warrants for sailors' personal vehicles, both current and any known to have been owned in 2009. The motion cited the prepaid SIM attribution, the DNA mixture result on Haley's key ring, the GPS waypoints, and the soil chemistry indicator. The judge granted the request on March 3rd. The expanded operation brought in a state forensic anthropologist and a canine team trained for human remains detection. The escalation to specialized science was justified, not by spectacle, but by the need to separate possibility from evidence. Recovery proceeded over 2 days, March 7th and 8th. The scene was controlled with entry logs, PPE requirements, and a single evidence staging tent. Photographs show the tent's interior, folding tables, paper forms clipped to boards, and sealed bags arranged in numbered rows. The smell of cold earth and fuel from a portable heater was noted by a technician in a field log. The remains detection canine alerted near the original excavation area and again along a shallow drainage line. Each alert was logged with time, handler notes, and wind direction. Forensic team recovered partial human skeletal remains from the drainage line at 2:11 p.m. on March 7. The recovery was documented with grid coordinates and depth measurements. The remains were incomplete and dispersed, consistent with environmental movement over time. A second recovery area yielded a boot sole and a metal D-ring consistent with hiking or work footwear. The boot sole pattern was photographed with a scale and later compared to the unphotographed impression once observed in Haley's Subaru floor mat. Because the original mat impression had been distorted and poorly documented, the comparison could not be definitive. The inability to compare cleanly became a procedural consequence, not a narrative choice. Identification required a method that could survive in court. On March 18th, the state lab completed a DNA comparison between the recovered remains and Haley's family reference sample. The report concluded the remains were consistent with being Haley Curtis, with statistical support sufficient for identification. The report was filed as an official identification document and transmitted to the county attorney. The language was technical and stripped of emotion. The case status changed from missing person to homicide investigation, not because intent had been proven, but because the circumstances of disappearance and recovery met the legal and investigative threshold. Investigators then moved to make evidence admissible fact through documentation, not inference. The GPS unit from Sailor's shop was sent for further examination, including file system analysis to determine whether any waypoint creation dates could be recovered. The examiner found that the device did not retain creation timestamps for saved locations, but did retain a history file with partial, date-coded entries from early 2009. The history file included a coordinate cluster consistent with the state route turnout where Haley's Subaru was found, recorded on February 3, 2009, in the evening hours. The device's internal clock could have been manipulated, and the examiner documented that possibility. They also documented there was no evidence of clock adjustment in the surrounding logs. The result did not stand alone. It became one strand in a braided evidentiary picture. Financial records were used as another strand. A subpoena to Sailor's Bank produced statements showing a cash withdrawal on February 2, 2009, and a purchase at an Elk Mountain convenience store on the morning of February 3rd. The purchase was paid in cash, which is common and not incriminating. What mattered was the merchant copy of the receipt retained in archived store records, which included a transaction time and a partial description. Prepaid minutes card. The store manager in 2022 provided an affidavit about how prepaid cards were sold and how records were stored. The affidavit was not used to claim Sailor bought the prepaid phone. It was used to show the availability of such cards in the area at the relevant time and to support the reasonableness of the prepaid account having local origins. On April 6, 2022, Brent Sailor was arrested on a warrant charging him with first-degree murder and kidnapping, based on a probable cause affidavit that ran 41 pages. The affidavit did not include a confession. It included timelines, records, and physical links. It cited the prepaid SIM recovered from his desk as the source of the blocked call to the ranger station. It cited the tower registrations placing that phone near the station around the alarm event and near the turnout where Haley's Subaru was later found. It cited the mixed DNA result on Haley's keyring as consistent with his profile. It cited GPS history entries consistent with travel to the turnout on the relevant date. It cited the lease property records, tying him to the recovery site. The delivery driver was re-interviewed and ultimately not charged. Investigators determined the driver's unscheduled return was real, but likely facilitated by a request from Sailor to retrieve paperwork, supported by the shop's spreadsheet entry and an invoice note. The driver's role remained a contradiction in the story of the day, a reminder that presence and involvement are not synonyms. The driver's statement was preserved as potential testimony about the return trip and about Sailor's access to delivery operations. The decision not to charge was documented in a memo from the county attorney, emphasizing evidentiary standards rather than certainty. Pretrial proceedings moved the case from investigative documents into court filings. Defense motions challenged the admissibility of the DNA mixture from the keyring, arguing contamination due to early handling and improvised packaging. The prosecution responded with lab testimony about mixture interpretation and with chain of custody logs showing the item's sealed status from 2009 onward, despite early handling. The judge issued a ruling allowing the DNA evidence for the limited purpose of demonstrating consistency, not exclusivity. The distinction was critical. It constrained how the evidence could be described to a jury. A second defense motion challenged the tower data, arguing coverage uncertainty in rural Wyoming. The prosecution presented carrier records and an FBI cellular analysis summary explaining the limitations and why the pattern of registrations across multiple locations was probative when viewed with other evidence. The court allowed the evidence with a cautionary instruction. The documentary record of those hearings is dry, filled with exhibits and page references. It is also where cold case work becomes durable. A story becomes a case only when its components can survive. Cross-examination. On October 17, 2022, Saylor entered a plea agreement to avoid trial, pleading guilty to second-degree murder and unlawful disposal of a body. The plea colloquy transcript reflects a narrow factual basis: that he contacted Haley, that he caused her death, and that he transported and concealed her remains. The transcript does not include motive beyond personal reasons, and the court did not require detail beyond what supported the plea. The agreement required him to provide the location of remains already recovered and to waive appeal on specified evidentiary issues. The record closes doors as well as it opens them. Even with a plea, an unanswered detail remained in the file. Haley's cell phone was never recovered, and the file contains no verified explanation for its absence. The grocery receipt with dog food remained in its envelope, a marker of routine that did not protect her. The key ring, once a lost item in a volunteer's bare hand, had become a central exhibit argued over by attorneys. The highway map, once returned to a vehicle and forgotten, now existed as a marked sheet found in a storage bin, its pencil lines cataloged but not interpreted in open court. The case achieved resolution mechanics, but it did not become complete. On November 28, 2022, the court entered judgment and sentence in the state of Wyoming v. Brent Saylor. The sentencing order is a standard form with appended pages, signed and filed, noting a term of imprisonment consistent with the plea agreement and credit for time served. The order contains no narrative. It does not describe Haley Curtis as a person beyond her name and the classification of the offense. That is how the system closes a case, with a document that can be enforced, not a story that can be understood. Carbon County's homicide case report was updated the same week to reflect disposition. The update included a final evidence list with exhibit numbers corresponding to the plea proceeding. The Forest Service key ring was assigned a new tag for court, but its original bag, with marker bleeding into plastic, was retained as part of the chain of custody history. The receiving log sheet with the clarified plate digit was filed under Document Examination Exhibits. The overlooked detail now elevated to the level of a decisive procedural fact. The prepaid SIM card, recovered from a desk drawer 13 years after it was used, was sealed in a heat-sealed pouch with an evidence tape overlay and initials from 3 different handlers. Each one recorded on a custody sheet. The institutional impact of the case appeared in internal policy changes that were documented without moral language. In January 2023, the Sheriff's Office adopted a revised major incident checklist for missing persons involving public employees or workplace disappearances. The checklist required immediate scene control, early collection of building alarm logs, and a standard protocol for documenting find locations with GPS coordinates and photographs before movement. These were not innovations. They were steps the agency acknowledged it had not consistently taken in. 2009. The policy memo cites case. Review outcomes but does not name Haley. The omission is typical of internal documents that aim for general compliance. Rather than memorial. The Forest Service also issued a brief district directive addressing contractor access and after-hours contact protocols. The directive required any return visits by vendors to be logged and supervised and required that ranger station staff not meet contractors alone after hours in winter months. The directive was procedural, not emotional. It treated Haley's disappearance as a risk management event as much as a crime. The directive's existence was later confirmed through a public records request, and it sits in the documentary record as a quiet indication that institutions respond by narrowing the conditions under which harm can recur. For Haley's family, closure came through paperwork and return property rather than explanation. The court ordered the return of personal items recovered during the investigation, excluding those retained as exhibits. The property receipt signed by a family member lists a small set of items: a dog leash from the Subaru, the wallet recovered from the ranger station desk drawer, and the grocery receipt, now preserved in a protective sleeve because the thermal ink had faded further. The list is short. The absence of other items is itself a form of record-based truth. What was never recovered could not be returned. The case retained unanswered questions that were not resolved by the plea, because pleas are designed to finalize, not to illuminate. No verified motive was entered into evidence beyond what met the legal requirements. No complete account of Haley's movements after 6:14 p.m. on February 3, 2009, exists in the file. The alarm arm event at 6:22 p.m. suggests an earlier departure or a different person arming the station, but the file cannot state which with certainty. The lack of a recovered cell phone prevents confirmation of any communications between Haley and Saylor, beyond the blocked call and tower registrations. In the final investigative summary, the DCI agent wrote a single line: "Phone remains outstanding." It is an admission that the record, even at its end, contains a blank space. The anchor objects that carried the case across two timelines remain in institutional custody, each one transformed by process. The key ring moved from a snowbank to an evidence shelf to a courtroom exhibit and back to storage, now attached to a tag that lists multiple case numbers. The receiving log sheet moved from routine paperwork to forensic document analysis. The prepaid SIM moved from anonymous commerce to attributed artifact. The highway map, once returned to a vehicle and then discovered in a storage bin, became a cataloged item whose markings could be shown but not fully interpreted without speculation. The grocery receipt remained what it had always been: proof that Haley's day began with care for her dog and expectation of going home. In March 2024, Carbon County conducted a final cold case audit entry on the file, not because it was active, but because it had been reopened and resolved. The audit form includes boxes: checked for identification confirmed, suspect, adjudicated, and evidence. Retention schedule updated. The retention schedule required long-term storage of biological evidence and key exhibits. The banker's box label was replaced with a printed one, but the old handwritten label was kept inside the file as a historical artifact. The new label reads Curtis, Haley homicide adjudicated, and it is affixed straight, centered, as if alignment could impose order on what occurred. The final image in the documentary record is not a landscape or a photograph of a person. It is a scanned evidence room ledger page with a barcode, a date, and a brief description. Key ring of Sexhibita. The ink is clean, the typeface modern, and the entry sits among hundreds of others. In the margin, a clerk wrote a small note in pencil: "Do not destroy." It is not a memorial sentence. It is an instruction, the system's way of acknowledging that even after conviction, objects must remain ready to speak if the record is challenged. If you want to keep watching work like this, use the end screen to choose the next case file reconstruction that stays close to documents, procedure, and what can actually be shown.